We read earlier from Hebrews chapter 4, and this morning we are looking at the final verse of that chapter, Hebrews chapter 4 and verse 16. Let us then approach the throne of grace with confidence, so that we may receive mercy and find grace to help us in our time of need. And this verse then speaks about need. It speaks about our time of need. And everybody knows such times. Everybody knows what it means to be in need. Every Christian goes through times of need. There are times we need help. There are times we need reassurance. There are times we need courage. There are times we need forgiveness. There are times we need to change and put things right. Times of need. And of course, we always have needs. We are needy people. But then there are times on top of that, aren't there, when we are especially conscious of those needs. What are we to do in times of need? Well, sometimes in times of need, we try to tough it out, don't we? And we try to give the impression that we can cope because we're strong and we can handle this. At other times, we fall into the opposite extreme, don't we? And in times of need, we panic. And we lose our way and we give up. And in both of those extremes, in times of need, trying to tough it out ourselves on the one hand, or panicking on the other hand, in both of those extremes, we make the same mistake. We forget God. So what is the right way? What is the biblical way? What is the Christian way to respond in times of need? Well, this verse tells us. Let us then approach the throne of grace with confidence, so that we may receive mercy and find grace to help us in our time of need. The Christian way to respond in times of need is to come to the throne of grace. So let's try and open that up a little this morning and see what this verse is telling us. First of all, we see here that we approach a throne. And that throne is God's throne. In times of need, we approach the throne of God. To approach something, of course, is to come near to it. And we're being told here to come near to God, to come near to God's throne. In the Gospels, we read of people, don't we, who approached Jesus Christ, who came near to Jesus Christ in times of need. Many people we read of. Just a couple of examples. Matthew chapter 9 and verse 20. Well, Matthew chapter 9 and verse 18. A ruler came and knelt before Jesus and said, my daughter has just died. Come and put your hand on her and she will live. And then a woman who had been subject to bleeding for 12 years came up behind him and touched the edge of his cloak. She said to herself, if only I touch his cloak, I will be healed. And then a few verses on, verse 28, when Jesus went indoors, some blind men came to him. People who came to Jesus. They came near to him in their need. Now we cannot physically do that in the way they did. We cannot physically draw near to Jesus. We cannot physically draw near to the throne of God. The throne of God is not found in a palace in one of the great cities in the world. We cannot visit it. We cannot see it. We cannot physically walk up to it. But we are told here to approach the throne of God. We are told to approach the throne of God, which is in heaven. And that's what we do, isn't it? We draw near to God in heaven. Jesus taught his disciples to pray, "Our Father in heaven." And when we approach God in heaven, we approach one who is upon a throne. Oh, a throne speaks of majesty, doesn't it? A throne speaks of power. A throne speaks of authority. And when we approach God's throne, we approach one who has all majesty and power and authority. We sang a few minutes ago, Psalm 93. The Lord reigns. He is robed in majesty. The Lord is robed in majesty and armed in strength. Your throne was established long ago. You are from all eternity. We approach this throne, the throne of God. So often in life, in our lives, in the lives of other people, in the life of the world around us, things have the appearance of chaos, don't they? From our perspective, so much is chaotic and seems to be out of control. And yet God is enthroned in heaven. And from the throne of heaven, God rules over everything. Everything that happens here on earth. The great world events that make the news headlines. God is enthroned in heaven and rules over them. Down to the smallest details. The smallest details of life. God is enthroned in heaven and rules over them. Now, what's the smallest detail of life you can think of? Well, didn't the Lord Jesus once say to his disciples that the very hairs of your head are numbered? God's rule from his throne extends to such details as that. God is enthroned and rules over everything. Think of the book of Revelation. The book of Revelation was written to persecuted Christians. And in almost every chapter of the book of Revelation, we read of God upon his throne. In all that they were suffering, they were assured, those early persecuted Christians, that God, their God, was upon the throne. And so the one that we approach in time of need is enthroned. He is sovereign over everything. Including our times of need, including the things that cause us need. The very needs that we bring before him. He is sovereign over them all. So we approach God's throne. But then notice, secondly, how God's throne here is described. It's described as the throne of grace. The throne of grace. Now, God's throne, as we have just read from Psalm 93, is a throne of majesty. It's a throne of power. It's a throne of authority. And for those who remain in their sin, God's throne is also a throne of judgment. In the book of Revelation, chapter 6 and verse 16, we read this. The people called to the mountains and the rocks, fall on us. Hide us from the face of him who sits on the throne and from the Lamb. For the great day of their wrath has come, and who can stand? There is a day coming when the judgment of God will come from the throne of heaven and will come upon the earth. Will come upon all who have walked the earth. So this throne is a throne of majesty and glory and power, and it is a throne of judgment, but for those who know the Lord. For those who've been saved from their sins, for those who've been forgiven their sins, this throne is also a throne of grace. God's grace is his love, his kindness that we do not deserve. And for God's people, his throne is a place where love and kindness are waiting for them. Not all thrones are like this, are they? Think of what we read in the Old Testament concerning Queen Esther, and how there was an occasion when Queen Esther had to approach the throne of her husband, King Xerxes, King Ahasuerus. And she was afraid. She was afraid to approach her husband's throne, because the Lord of the Medes and the Persians stated that if anybody approached the throne without being invited, they would be put to death. But he did invite her, and she was able to draw near to that throne. Well, to be a Christian is to be able to draw near to the throne of God. It's to be able to draw near to the throne of God, because that throne is a throne of grace. It's a throne from which God smiles upon his people. It's a throne from which God sends to his people help in time of need. And that leads to the third thing then we see in this verse. We've seen that we approach God's throne, and that God's throne is a throne of grace. And thirdly, then, we approach God's throne, we approach the throne of grace for help in time of need. When his people approach his throne in time of need, what does God give them? What does God do for them? Well, notice what this verse doesn't say. This verse doesn't say that when we approach the throne of grace in time of need, that God will immediately take those needs away. It doesn't say that. God is able to do that. And God sometimes does that. But he doesn't usually do that. Rather, this verse tells us that when the Lord's people approach his throne in times of need, he gives them grace to help them in their time of need. He has compassion upon his people in their weakness. And he gives them grace, he gives them strength to enable them as they face their different needs. You know, the Apostle Paul had that great need. We're not sure exactly what it was, but he describes it as a thorn in his flesh, and he kept on going to the Lord and asking the Lord to take away this thorn in the flesh, and the Lord didn't take it away. But the Lord did say to Paul, "My grace is sufficient for you." My grace is sufficient. It's interesting that the word translated help here in verse 16. Approach the throne of grace that we may receive mercy and find grace to help us in our time of need. That word translated help is also found in the book of Acts, in Acts chapter 27. And in Acts chapter 27, the Apostle Paul was on a ship sailing near the island of Crete on his way to Rome. And as Paul and his companions sailed in the ship, a great storm arose. And the ship then was struggling. The sailors were struggling. They were in great danger. And when the sailors had a moment of respite from the storm, we're told this in verse 17, Acts 27, verse 17, that when the men had hoisted the lifeboat aboard, they passed ropes under the ship to hold it together. They passed ropes under the ship to hold it together. The interesting thing is there that the word translated ropes, at least in this translation, is the same word translated help in Hebrews 4, verse 16. I think the Authorized Version has help in Acts chapter 27. So here was this boat in a great storm. And there was a danger of this boat breaking up in the storm. And so the sailors, they got ropes and they passed them beneath the ship, and the ropes, they held the ship together. They supported the ship. They helped the ship in the time of storm. And from the throne of grace, God sends help to his people in time of need. Help to his people when they are in the storm. And so when you go through time of need, when you find yourself in a storm, don't just try to tough it out yourself. You're not strong enough to hold the ship together. And admit that and go to the throne of grace and ask God to give you the mercy and the grace and the help that you need. Ask God, as it were, to tie those ropes around you and to keep you strong. But on the other hand, when you're in time of need and going through a storm, don't panic. Don't lose your way. Don't give up. The ship doesn't have to fall apart. Remember that there's a throne of grace, and that the one seated upon the throne can hold the ship together. Ask him for the mercy and the grace that will help you in your time of need. Let us approach the throne of grace so that we may receive mercy and find grace to help us in our time of need. But there's something else, isn't there, in this verse? Which is that we can approach this throne with confidence. Let us then approach the throne of grace with confidence so that we may receive mercy and find grace to help us in our time of need. Now, we could ask the question, how can this be? Because didn't we see a few minutes ago from Revelation chapter 6 that the throne of God is a throne of judgment and wrath for those who are in their sins. The judgment of God there is poured out from the throne. And maybe you wonder, well, how could I possibly approach such a throne with confidence? How can this throne be a throne of grace for me rather than a throne of judgment? How can I approach the throne of God in time of need with confidence that he will help me rather than turn me away? Well, the reason that the Lord's people can approach the throne of God with confidence is that God himself has provided the way for them to do it. Left to ourselves, we could never approach this throne. We could never draw near to the throne of God. We would be consumed if we tried to do so. But God himself has opened up the way to his throne. And he's done that through the work of his Son, Jesus Christ. The way to know the throne of God as a throne of grace. The way to know the throne of God as a throne that you can approach with confidence is to know Jesus Christ. The opening chapters of this letter, indeed the whole of this letter, are about the greatness of Jesus Christ and his work. And it's on the basis of Jesus Christ and the work that he has done that we are able to approach the throne of God, and that we're able to do it with confidence. And that's explained to us in the verses before this, in verses 14 and 15. We can approach the throne of God with confidence because Jesus Christ is there, seated at God's right hand. Verse 14, since we have a high priest who has gone through the heavens, Jesus, the Son of God, let us hold firmly to the faith we profess. Jesus is the Son of God, and he is our great high priest. And just as in the Old Testament, the high priest once a year offered a sacrifice to deal with the sin of the people, and then entered the most holy place in the temple to represent the people before God. So Jesus Christ, once for all, on the cross offered the great sacrifice to deal with sin, and has entered the most holy place, has entered heaven, has entered the throne room of God to represent his people before God. And it's through him that we can draw near to God. If your faith is in Jesus Christ this morning, you can draw near to the throne of God because Jesus is there. And Jesus represents you there. We've seen that this verse speaks of time of need. Coming to the throne of God in time of need. Now what's your greatest need? Now, what's my greatest need? Of course, we all have many needs, as we've seen, and some of those needs especially press in and dominate our minds at any given point. But there is one need that is greater than all of us. The need for your sin to be forgiven. The need for you to know God, the need for you to be saved from the holy wrath of God upon sin. And where do you have that need dealt with? Will you draw near to the throne of God? And trusting in Jesus Christ, trusting in his death upon the cross, you ask God to show you mercy. You ask God to show you grace. You ask God to forgive you. You cannot approach the throne of God because you think you're a good person, or because you're a churchgoer, or because of anything like that. You can only approach this throne through Jesus Christ. And then we keep on approaching the throne through Jesus Christ. Day by day, As we fall into sin, we bring those sins back to the throne of God, trusting in Jesus Christ, looking to God to forgive us. And all the other needs we have, all the other difficulties we face, we bring them to him. All the other burdens we carry, we bring them into the throne room of God. Trusting in Jesus Christ, looking to God to give us grace to help us in these needs. I was talking to somebody the other day who's been staying with some other people, and they said, I don't know how much longer I can stay. I don't want to outstay my welcome. You can never outstay your welcome at the throne of grace. God always welcomes his people to his throne. So they come to him, trusting in, joined to his Son, Jesus Christ. So we approach this throne with confidence because Jesus Christ is there at the throne, seated at God's right hand. And then we approach this throne with confidence because Jesus Christ sympathizes with us in our need. Verse 15. We do not have a high priest who is unable to sympathize with our weaknesses, but we have one who's been tempted in every way, just as we are, yet was without sin. Let us then approach the throne of grace with confidence. Jesus Christ, our Savior, our great high priest, who represents us at the throne of God. He's lived in this world as a man. He's able to sympathize with us in our weakness. What are some of the needs, particular needs you have right now? Do you think of any of them? Well, I can't take this need to the throne of grace. This is too painful for me to take to the throne of grace. This is too embarrassing for me to take to the throne of grace. This is too big and complicated for me to take to the throne of grace. This is too small. This is too trivial for me to take to the throne of grace. You never have to think like that. Jesus Christ, our high priest, has lived in this world. He's been tested, he's been tempted, he's been tried in all kinds of ways. He knows what it is to go through time of need. He lived a sinless life in this world, which, when you think about it, made life in this world harder for him than it is for us. And he now represents his people in heaven. Represents his people at the throne of grace. Before the throne of God above, I have a strong, a perfectly, a great high priest whose name is love, whoever lives and pleads for me. So what is the Christian way? What is the biblical way of responding to times of need? Let us then approach the throne of grace with confidence, so that we may receive mercy and find grace to help us in our time of need.